Get ready before life happens. The podcast helping you navigate life's what ifs.
Welcome to Get Ready Before Life Happens. I'm your host, Tony Stewart. Today I'm joined by Rahkim Sabree, author and financial therapist. Rahkim, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, excited to have you back. So, tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your origin story and how did it lead to you focusing on financial trauma?
Oof, loaded question. I think if I could frame this through a particular lens, I think all of our origin stories really kind of point us in the direction of financial trauma, right? As we become socialized financially, or I talk about it through this lens of financial socialization that has us view money as a threat. Maybe not from a conscious perspective, but definitely from a body or somatic perspective, right? And so that threat kind of triggers us to respond in a number of ways. That can look like vigilance, that can look like scarcity, that can look like anything in the in between. Um, for me particularly, my origin story started in Mount Vernon, New York, where I grew up. My parents were young parents. They separated, and suddenly I was thrown into this mindset of I have to help my mom manage the finances in the household. And so, in order for me to do that, I had to understand what was happening. And so then I became aware of the Section 8 that we had, the food stamps that we had, just the process of helping my mom take bills over to, check cashing to pay the light bill or take a money order over to the property management company to pay the rent. And so in some ways, it kind of forced me to grow or mature in areas faster than would otherwise occur. But I think the internalization of her financial stress by me at that age also created in me this drive to, first of all, feel like I was a good manager of money, even though the money wasn't mine. And second of all, to not experience the tightness of how our experience was in that moment. Now, I'd say for most people, outside of what it is that I just painted for you, those experiences with money start even earlier, but we don't have the vocabulary or the ability to recognize what it is that we're experiencing at that young age. But if you can think about um, being in the presence of, your caretakers, your parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, whoever, and picking up on the stress that they have when it comes to money at a young age. Maybe that looks like you can't get the Christmas present that you're looking for, or maybe that looks like you can't afford to stop at the gift shop when you go on the school trip. These little things signal or message or are our messages to us around what money represents. Maybe we make associations in childhood around whether or not our parents love us or love us more or as much as, the next kid whose parents bought them the thing, right? And so that financial socialization starts very young. Um, I'll pause there because I think that kind of answers your question. I know we're going to get deeper into this as the conversation unfolds.
Yeah, well, is I think people really underestimate how our past experiences with money, and a lot of it is subconscious, is like you mentioned, as you're a kid. So you're still processing and absorbing it, but you have no idea that that's actually happening. I want to kind of actually, before we jump further into financial trauma in your book, I want to talk about generational wealth because I think it's something that people don't understand. If you come from a privileged background where you do have the money to stop at the gift shop and all those things, is I guess, I'm trying to think of the best question to ask you is, like, what is generational wealth and what should people know about that to, take into account, like, hey, somebody may not have had the same privileges I had growing up.
Yeah, this is a great question. I have a lot of thoughts running through my head right
Go for
now.
it.
When we talk about generational wealth, particularly as financial professionals, a lot of times that phrasing is tied into a product or service that we offer, right? Where it's kind of like the dangling of a carrot, if you will, to individuals who don't have privilege, and saying, "Hey, I have the answer to solve this problem of the lack of wealth that's been passed generation to generation." But I thought it was really interesting your phrasing in the question, specifically as it relates to people who experience or who have privilege, because from a financial trauma lens, I think a lot of times the assumption is that people who don't have the privilege or who don't have the wealth are the only ones capable of experiencing that financial trauma. And so I touch on this idea of generational wealth in my book, Overcoming Financial Trauma. And I say, generational wealth requires generational buy-in. And so when we look at, some of the more kind of firm, structured examples of wealth passing through generations, it's not just the handoff of assets from one generation to the next, right? It's the handoff of ideals and values and really kind of a playbook for this is what was done to get us to this place. This is what is expected of you to keep us in this place and so on and so forth. Getting into a little bit more of the complex financial planning side of things, sometimes that is baked into the structure of like not trust documents, but the trust entity, right? There are instructions, there are criteria, there are rules. And so the estate planning by the individual who has either amassed the wealth or started kind of the snowball rolling downhill to grow the wealth says, this is the direction that I would like to navigate or steer the ship. But that wealth can be lost within the next two generations if the next two generations are not on board with what the original kind of operating plan was. And so you may be second, third, fourth, maybe more generation of having benefited from the wealth that was accumulated at one point and the direction for what that wealth looks like. And at the same time, not have the quote unquote financial literacy because somebody else is managing that wealth for you to know how to move with that because the rules are already baked into the documents that guide what that wealth looks like. So speaking to, a population of people who don't have that privilege, right? Not only are they having to figure out how do I get my hands on some wealth, right? How do I build wealth? They're also having to figure out how do I structure that wealth without really a game plan, or a playbook and just creating from scratch what that process looks like. And so, I beat up on the business of financial literacy, right? And I use this language very intentionally. I beat up on the business of financial literacy because a lot of times it casts shame, blame, guilt onto individuals who don't have that playbook, assuming that individuals who do have that playbook are quote unquote financially literate. But my experience in working with the wealth spectrum, right? High net worth, high income, and individuals that don't have any money is really counterintuitive to what that narrative is, right? I've seen people who have low income, no assets, be very financially literate, right? They know how to use the systems, they know how to use the tools, they know what they should be doing, they just don't make enough money. And I've seen people who are wealth management, private wealth client just come in and they're spending the money and they don't know what they're doing. They have somebody in the background telling them this is how much you can use, this is what you have to write. They don't have any financial literacy. They just have the benefit of somebody who is working for them. And so bringing this back all home, I know this is kind of a long answer. From a financial trauma lens, it is kind of like that double-sided sword, right? It can impact anybody with or without privilege. In fact, it probably does impact everybody with or without privilege in different ways because the individual with privilege is now so worried about How do I keep and or maintain what is status quo for me? And so there's a sense of vigilance there, right? What can I do to either grow my money or to hold on to the money that I have? And then, on the other side of that, the individual who doesn't have money, who doesn't have the high income so that they can then invest in assets that grow their net worth, they're worried about survival on a day-to-day basis, right? I would like to get involved in investing and building wealth and, creating this idea of generational wealth, but I also have to make it until next Friday, right? And so I think that's where the conversation around financial literacy becomes very murky because we often, financial educators, financial practitioners, and professionals will cast this kind of narrative of, oh, you're living paycheck to paycheck. You don't know what you're doing. Let me give you some financial literacy. And really, the answer for that particular individual might be, I just need to make more money so that I can get out of this survival state, so that I can do the things that I would like to do. I have a very firm belief that, people don't, particularly in, this capitalism driven economy, people don't want to be poor, right? Like that's not a choice that somebody
Yeah.
makes, right? However, it is a byproduct of capitalism that there are the haves and there are the have-nots. And so in that state of being a have-not, I find that people are in a race against time to not only survive in the moment or establish safety, which I think is important, framing, but also they want to do the things. They want to invest in the stock market. And maybe they're afraid, or maybe they don't feel like they make enough or they have enough. And, there's a case to be made around where education is important. But I think where overall the industry is moving and acknowledgement is that the education piece is not like um the sum, right? Like the all end all be all. Education is a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I completely agree. Is that I think financial literacy, like you said, it doesn't help if somebody doesn't have the money to invest. It's great teaching them to invest, but if you have no money to invest, is like, okay, that's pretty useless at that point. So you have to take into account where somebody is and provide them actually the tools to help them, do the best that they can with what they have. And like you said, is like, if it requires increasing income, well, what are some ideas to increase income that they can actually do? And if somebody is coming, they might be working two jobs. So it's like, in trying to make ends meet, they're a single parent family. You have all these things that there's not a one size fits all, that it's more about like, how do you help them optimize what they have and what's, really possible for them, and not like this whole pie in the sky thing is like, you need to create a diversified portfolio and here's how a mutual fund works. And like you said, is they're like, okay, how am I going to pay my rent?
Right.
So,
And I think it's also important to add in this conversation, because it's been coming up a lot in the conversations that I've been having. When we talk about this idea of increasing income, particularly for individuals who are dependent on government subsidies like food stamps, like Section 8, right? There's what is referred to as a benefits cliff, right? And so as long as you make under this dollar amount, you are entitled to these benefits. And I think, many people, I don't want to speak for people, but based off of what I've seen and kind of the responses that I've surveyed, individuals would like to make more money, but there's also a very real fear of, if I make just a dollar over what qualifies me for these subsidies, all of these go away, right? And so when we think about the individual who's working two jobs, or you know, this idea that we have to teach people how to make more money, we also have to think about what is it that they potentially will be letting go of in order to make that more money, right? If it's going to be a $5,000 a year different or a $10,000 a year difference, and then we account for taxes and insurance and all those things, does this put the individual in a worse position by way of what they can afford for food, or for housing than they were before they got the five or the $10,000 a year raise? And is it worth it to them to give up those things, right? Maybe they have free healthcare through Medicaid. Maybe they have, $200, $300 a month in food stamps. Maybe they have Section 8. And so, they experience this elevation in income, but it's not so much that it accounts for the things that they're getting. And I think there's a resistance by some people to even make more than what they are allowed to qualify for because they're worried about how am I going to survive if this all falls onto me. And so again, a case of financial education, I think, and helping people to understand how to budget their income and really, have their own personal agency, but at the same time, a sensitive topic for financial educators and something that I think is important for us going into client interactions or educational models to take into account when making these recommendations, because this is somebody's livelihood that they may not know any other way.
Yeah, and it's hard because it almost becomes a trap because it's like you don't want to earn that extra $2,000 because like Medicaid Medicaid is a very valuable thing. And it's like all of a sudden you got to pay for your health insurance. That's not realistic.
Right.
Um, so it's like it's a bigger problem for us as a society is like, okay, well, how do we make that equitable so people can transition to, you know, that next stage rather than facing a benefits cliff? And that's a problem. People get trapped, and that's a generational trap sometimes. Is
Absolutely.
so yeah, no simple answers here.
Definitely
So
not. But I think you hit the nail on the head, right? When you talk about this is a larger societal issue. It's not the personal failure of one individual here or, one individual there. And so when we look at like this societal wound that people are experiencing, um, again, I think this is kind of like the theme of our conversation today. The education is important, and also what are the circumstances that exist on a systemic or institutional level that have people trapped in the way that, you've described, and sometimes for generations. And is it fair for us, or for individuals who have experienced the privilege of not being in that trap, to point the finger and say, "Oh, you are a bad person, you're lazy," or whatever, without really understanding the variables that have placed the individual in that position, right? When we look at medical debt and how that has forced bankruptcies of many Americans. One day you have it all, and the next day you don't, right? Like, you experience some debilitating illness, you can't go to work, now you're dependent. And so, if you're the breadwinner in your household, everybody else in the household suffers. And so this creates this like ripple effect of sorts that again doesn't just impact the individual, but impacts entire families, entire communities. And this is systemic, right? Like this is, I don't want to stand on a soapbox here, but when we look at the cost of health insurance, and healthcare in general in this country, um, it's astronomical. And so, even people who are doing well are feeling the pinch when it comes to, okay, well, how am I going to pay for my healthcare?
yeah. Well, I think you said something that I think is really important, and this happens in the media a lot, is people think, well, somebody's lazy because they're getting public benefits. And that's not the case. I mean, maybe there is one person who is lazy and they're getting, social benefits, but that's not the usual case. Is like you said, is that's not a position anybody wants to be in. So it's like I think people need to take that into account, and unfortunately, that's a popular portrayal in the media quite often, depending on where you get your news from. Um, and that's a whole other discussion. We don't need to talk about where people get their news from.
Yeah.
So, let's talk about your book just for a minute. Is what inspired you to write Overcoming Financial Trauma? What made you decide, like, hey, I got to actually write a book now?
Good question. So funny enough, when I was approached by Wiley, who was my publisher, I was not planning on writing a book on financial trauma. What I will share, though, I think some of the converging variables that make this a very happy, I don't want to call it an accident, but a very happy turn of events is that I was already writing on Substack under the Overcoming Financial Trauma name, right? And so my Substack had grown in popularity over the years that I've been writing on it. It won at that point several awards, so two Plutus Awards. I won an award for AFCP from AFCPE for Consumer Financial Information Award. I had been reached out to by the Pew Research Center because they had heard about
Uh,
financial trauma. There was just a lot of visibility going towards like this idea of, somebody talking about financial trauma almost exclusively. And even before the awards, I had this is before this at the time the algorithm was very friendly to links and Twitter. I would write articles that were social commentary on things that were happening in current events. And then I would plug the link into some of the big pages talking about these things. And then people, as a result, would click on it and they would read. And, I would grow my audience that way and get a lot of views. And so there was one article in particular where I think I had gotten over 30,000 views for sure. It could have been as high
wow.
as 60,000 views. And this is organic, no audience. I had less than 1,000 subscribers, um, no paid ads, just independent media that I was creating. And I think that was the turning point for me. Forbes noticed, and so I had become a contributor to Forbes based off of my readership there. And at the same time, I had my own podcast also called Overcoming Financial Trauma, where I was recording interviews with different people just on the topic. So I had created this brand around overcoming financial trauma in the background. And um, I had been talking about financial trauma since I want to say 2022. So there was a brand being built around my name, Rahkim Sabree, being associated with this phrase, financial trauma, that many people were hearing for the very first time. I won't say that I created it because I didn't, but people were hearing about financial trauma for the first time from me. And so, in an effort to codify this language, once I got into conversations with Wiley, my initial idea was to re-release Financially Irresponsible, which was my second book, with updated information and narratives around the things that I had learned from the initial publishing in 2019 to the present moment. And Wiley was like, no, we don't want sloppy seconds, right? Like we want an original idea, we want something new. Do you have any other ideas? And I was like, well, I've been spending a lot of time in this space around financial trauma and financial therapy. I don't see a lot of content that is trade published specifically talking about this particular topic. Um, and so we went through this whole process of me pitching and, them going back to their editorial board and, some back and forth that took almost a year before we landed on a contract. And even at that point, we didn't have a title for the book picked out yet. So signed the contract. The working title in the contract of the book was Financial Therapy. And I was like, well, I do think that it's important to talk about financial therapy, but I don't think that it's important for me to talk about financial therapy. I think it's important for me to talk about financial trauma. And so that's how the book kind of morphed into what it did. The original intended title of the book was The Financial Trauma Solution. And so we were going with that for a little while, but then the editorial team came back and they were like, we think overcoming financial trauma is a little bit more powerful. And I'm like, I agree. And also, I already have things that have the overcoming financial trauma name on it. And I was concerned about the shared IP and, them considering my previously created work as derivative works that, they would own and
Mm.
control. And so we had to kind of massage that out. But ultimately, we landed on the title Overcoming Financial Trauma. And so I'm like, all right, cool. We're going to go with it. And, collectively, we agreed that from a marketing perspective, people are already familiar with the phrasing tied into my name. And, they were just like, you run with it. So I started writing, and much of what I discussed about financial trauma was experience driven. It's based off of my life experience and some reading that I had done here and there. What I wanted this book to do was because I was concerned that people would not take it seriously, funny enough. So I wanted this book to do is sit at an intersection of research, practice, and experience, where I could speak through a very narrative lens on my own experiences, but also speak from an academic lens around this idea of financial trauma and financial therapy broadly, and also pull from the research of other people so that this book was evidence-based. And so many of in fact, not many, all of the people whose work I pull from in the deployment of this book, Dr. Joe Dispenza, Dr. Joy DeGroy, Dr. Resma Menakem, Dr. Brad Klontz, um, and others were Dr. Claude Anderson. These are all people who are, they have their terminal degree, right? They're all being referred to as doctor. And so their work is based off of research that they've done. And it's me kind of interpreting their work and tying it into this theme of financial trauma. And so um, I was successful. I was successful in being able to kind of distill and synthesize what it is that these different and these are not all medical doctors, right? These are doctors of, neuroscience, doctors of social work, doctors of psychology, bringing all of their work together and saying, hey, this is where you can find more about what they talk about, but this is how it's relevant to this moment. And kind of spinning that in my own experiences and reflections as a financial therapist based off of the clients that I've worked with, my own experience and reflections based off of growing up without privilege, going into, the workforce, working with people through a financial services lens, learning about financial therapy and behavioral finance and financial psychology, and really kind of putting everything that I know into this one place. The attitude that I had as I was writing was, if I never write anything again, I want this to be the thing, right? This is like my Picasso. And so I really tried to exhaust my knowledge and experience on the topic, which is a new topic for a lot of people, as I've mentioned, in this book, so that people can point to it as a manual of sorts, so that we can create shared language where I offer up a definition around financial trauma because there's so much ambiguity around how we define financial trauma right now, and really kind of connect the financial planning community, the mental health community, and I think also, like, equally important, the human resources community, because there are people who go into work who don't feel financially well, and they don't understand why. And so what I've seen in working with organizations that provide financial education as a benefit is that most of those conversations are centered around your retirement accounts, your 401ks, right? These are complementary services that the entity that's providing these services to the organization are coming in and explaining how it works, but it's not really addressing what is the root cause of employee financial stress. What is the root cause of burnout? What is the root cause of an employee's desire or lack of a desire to climb up the ranks in the corporate environment? What are some of these variables and aspects of showing up and putting on your work face that contribute to these feelings of all of the above, stress, burnout, etc. So I try to address those things and have a really candid language and messaging to the HR professionals so that they have the tools to then go back to their respective companies and say, hey, we need a more holistic financial wellness program.
That's awesome. There's so much there, and I think what you've been able to do is to make financial trauma an accepted word, and that it's a steady message that you've had talking about it. It's not an aside that somebody has talked about in an article and it's a one-off. Is that you've made it into a full conversation, with your Forbes articles, with writing a book, with your Substack, and that you speak, you know, around the financial services community on financial trauma. And I think that's amazing. And I would say to my financial literacy content creators in the audience is that this is an example of how having a niche is a way that you can grow your audience and really take on a real issue. I mean, I think that's why people really connect with you, is because you're really vested in addressing this issue. That you're not just writing academically about it. You're like, okay, this is a real issue. This is what we need to do about it. And I think that's why people really connect with the work you're doing. And that's why I've always connected with your work. It's because, like, hey, I learned something about financial trauma, but I'm also learning more so how it impacts everything else. And so, yeah, you've done an amazing job with that. Um, so, Rakeem, to wrap up, I have what I call the Get Ready Hot Take Trio. These are three quick questions that I ask all of my guests, more rapid fire in nature. The first one is, what's one myth you're trying to break about financial trauma?
Yeah, I love this one. Um, there's a couple. Which direction do I want to go with this? I
Go
think
with both.
okay. So one is that financial trauma only impacts people that don't have money. I think that's a really common myth and assumption, particularly for individuals who feel like, I've evolved past that, right? Or even financial planning professionals have kind of pushed back on, is this something that's important for me to address because my clients are high income, high net worth, right? So that's myth number one. Myth number two is that financial trauma is in some way, shape, or form a personal failing, right? Individuals struggle with financial trauma through a variety of lenses, and I talk about six sources of financial trauma in the book. But those lenses are both lenses that we can control and lenses that are outside of our control. So we talk about financial trauma through an institutional or systemic lens. We don't have control over that. We talk about financial trauma through a genetic or generational lens. We don't have control over that. We talk about financial trauma through a workplace or an employment lens. We have a degree of control, but if we are navigating a job market like the market that we are navigating now, where it's much more favorable to the employer and people are, I mean, I see this all the time on LinkedIn, applying for jobs, hundreds of jobs a week or a month, and sitting unemployed for 6 months, a year or more, they kind of have to accept whatever is out there. And so the employers have all the power in this moment. And I think this certainly contributes to the conversation around workplace and employment financial trauma. And there's financial hardship and poverty, right? We talked about that earlier. Nobody wants to be poor. Sometimes people fall into this, or sometimes people fall into hard times. I, for one, did not think that my entire life would change overnight, but I experienced a house fire 30 days before the book was published. And, that was a financially traumatic experience that I'm continuing to navigate in this moment. So, these things can happen to anyone at any time, and it doesn't mean that it's your fault or that you are unintelligent or that you are financially illiterate. It means that something happened to you related to your finances, and now you have to figure out the best way forward with first establishing safety in your mind and in your body, and then second, like what does the rebuild process look like? So, I think that's a super important myth to address.
Yeah, I love that, and we talked about that with generational wealth, but I think, we can see that in the gender pay gap, the pay gap for people of color, I mean, there's all these things, and they all have an impact. If you're starting off and you're making less money than somebody else doing the same job, it's going to be harder to achieve the same goals. That's a very powerful myth to break. So Raheem, let's get out the time machine for a minute. If you could go back in time, knowing what you know now about financial trauma, what advice would you give your younger self?
Oof. I like this question. What advice would I give myself? I think I would have. I think the easy answer for me is like, oh, save or invest more. But I want to go deeper than that. I think I would advise myself to invest more in higher income skill sets sooner, right? So um I'm entering year 5 of entrepreneurship this year. And I think only within the last 2 of those 5 years did I figure out what it is that I'm doing, right? So the first 3 years, I felt like kind of, and that's not to say that I didn't have high income skill sets, because certainly I was able to make a living in the first 3 years, but now I have a better understanding of business and how I want my business to look and, how to drive revenue and have conversations around sales and all, the things that are necessary. Um, and I think that more important, this may be a controversial take, more important than putting your money away is knowing how to make money first. Because in the event that you have some major life experience where that money is hit, you know how to go back and get more. So I would definitely encourage myself at a young age to learn a high income skill set.
Yeah, and I think that's powerful advice when we talk about generational wealth and some of these traps is, a family where nobody's gone to college is that's going to be harder is, we can debate the value of college, and that's a worthwhile debate in today's world. But college does give you certain skills and a certain leg up. But like you said, it's, having skills is a way to improve your financial life. So that's powerful advice. So to wrap up, what is your number one tip for changing the way we think about financial trauma?
Mm. Uh, this is also going to be a controversial take. Reject individualism, embrace community. And that might sound super abstract, so I'll go a little bit deeper. I believe that the root of much of the financial trauma that we experience is um, driven by capitalism. And capitalism does prioritize the individual, right? We feel like we have to do it alone. We feel like, we aspire to being self-made. Everybody has to have their own. There is not so much conversation being had around how can we do this together? How can we build together? How can we share in the success and in the creation of wealth? And one of the points that I kind of surface in my book is, this idea of individualism is a myth, right? Because there are people and organizations and communities. I instantly think of the PayPal mafia, right? Um, who they form this collective, they form this, sort of brotherhood where they benefit from each other's expertise, they benefit from each other's capital, they benefit from each other's network. And so, if we examine wealth in the process of building wealth through a lens that includes not just money, but who we're connected to, what opportunities we are exposed to, what our sphere of influence look like, what does our skill set look like? If we engage in building community, we will go much further than if we are trying to acquire each one of those individual variables on our own and build something by ourselves.
Well, I'm reminded of a quote, although I can't remember the full quote, is like, if you want to go far, or something, do you know?
If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I'm thinking about, because the value of your network is probably your most valuable business asset. It is who you know is a big part of it, in my mind. So, Raheem, where can people learn more about you, your work, and most importantly, pick up a copy of Overcoming Financial Trauma?
Yeah, so if you go to overcomingfinancialtrauma.com, it will redirect you to a page on my website where you can purchase a copy of Overcoming Financial Trauma through your preferred vendor, Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, Books A Million, and bookshop.org. Highly encourage people to support local independent bookstores. And so you could do that at bookshop.org, and you can select which bookstore you want to buy from. But if you prefer a brick and mortar like Barnes and Noble, or if it's super convenient for you to support Amazon, you can definitely check out the book there. While you are on my website, you can then navigate to the homepage, learn more about me, my work, how I'm engaging with communities right now. My priority for 2026 is exclusively speaking. And so I'm working with organizations, large and small, to further the message around financial trauma, through keynotes, workshops, book talks, and certainly if an organization is looking to buy books at a bulk rate, they can send me a message via email, which I believe is also present on my website, and I can discuss what bulk rates look like.
Cool, cool. And for everybody watching and listening, there will be all these links will be in the show notes. So if you have access to the show notes, you can find all the links there. Raheem, thanks for joining us on the Get Ready Before Life Happens podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thank you everyone, as always, for tuning in to this episode. If you learned something today to change the way you think about money and financial trauma, please be sure to subscribe and share with a friend. You can also go to my website at tonystewart.com to get access to my newsletter and a whole bunch of free resources. Until next time, let's change the way we think about money.